Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, researcher, and friend, John McKinnon, author of The Persuasive Preacher, The Gifted Prophet, and The Noble Politician. And together we're discussing Weaponized Religion, how Christian identity fused with early Christian fundamentalism and politics to form the foundation for the new Apostolic Reformation. Well, John, today we have a unusually weird episode. We're bringing into focus one of the side stories of all of this, and it's a side story that continued to progress long after latter rain developed and then fizzled out. I have actually had multiple former members of the cult that was established by this man that we're going to talk about today contact me, and according to them, which I have no way other than what I see in the news, which seems to affirm it, according to them, it's very eerily similar to what the allegations are with Mike Bickle and IHOP KC at the moment. There was apparently, according to the people that have contacted me, there was some unusual manipulation and grooming of women, according to what they told me. And I look it up, and apparently there are some substantiating claims in the news of what was happening. But anyway, this figure that we're talking about today, honestly, as I was researching and I came across this name, I had no idea who it was, and find out that Branham, his early ministry, was connected to it. I just got curious, and I came to realize that without him, it would have, the message itself may not have looked in the same way that it did. This figure, even though he has just a blip in our history, he appears to have helped shaped it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, John, and we haven't spoken prior to this episode here, but it's interesting you mentioned about the allegations against Avak, and I came across some very confirming evidence that I'll share later that talks about the grooming of women and so forth in this movement. And early on, when I used to hear about Avak, and I knew he was from Iran and was a healer from Iran, I always thought he had to go back to Iran because I knew that was the thing. But actually, Avak stayed in the United States. He had to leave the country for a short period of time before he got deported, but he actually ended up creating a religious movement of people that followed him all through his life. But it's interesting to see about the women that he groomed, and how the women he eventually had for his own harem stayed with him. But we'll go through that later. But today we're exploring some parallels. There's some real intriguing parallels between Branham's ministry and Avak Hagopian that I'll mention throughout the podcast. But both of them came through the 20th century, and they had messages from God. They claimed to speak for God and even claimed prophetic utterances. Hagopian emphasized on divine healing. It actually mirrors Branham's focus, and their one-time meeting, it was for different reasons, and we'll talk about Clem Davies. At the time, Clem Davies was supporting Avak, and he got involved, and we'll see it was all for the money for Clem, and they saw the potential to make lots of money using Avak's ministry. And that's much the same way we see with Gordon Lindsay. Voice of Healing got organized around Branham because there was a lot of money to be made, and it's astronomical what you see that when they took up the offerings. We'll go through that later, how much money they got. But these faith healers, they would present themselves as just unique people claiming divine, visitations from God, from angels, even from God or Jesus himself. And so there was a lot of relationship between him and Branham on that, and the followers just flocked to it. Avak had really gathered quite a following, and had he have had any effect on Arkelian's son that called him over here from Iran, and had he had actually healed his son or had some effect upon him, I'm sure he would have had a huge following, even larger than Branham's at the time, if he would have had any success at all. But it was only because he didn't have the success that he came over here to do that his popularity in the West Coast, diminished, and he actually ended up moving over to the East Coast, where people didn't know him as well, and he could act like he was a great healer. So they both had these personal revelations, and most of the material I got, I actually found a book, and I don't know if you found it, John, but it was a German that wrote a book about Avak. His name was Roy Wehrmanchuk, and you've got it. Yeah. And I found the English version of that. I don't know if his is in German there, but so I can just say that in these ministries, I can say with a fact that not one person was ever healed by these men. If anybody ever was healed, it was, of course, the power of God himself, his sovereignty, his grace. But these men just wanted power and control over people, or they desired just to get the lifestyle that they wanted to live out. And that's how they just wanted that contentment in life, the things they wanted to do. So each had their own goals. But in the end, Avak seemed content with his own smaller following of people. He didn't seem to desire a nationwide following. But Branham, on the other hand, he really wanted the world to follow him, I think, and believe his message was from God. And most of Branham, in the end, he ended up being very satisfied with just a small core network of people, and at the expense of the rest of the world and Christianity. He said, "Fooey on you. I'm just going to take my core following that really believes I'm the man of the hour." But when you look at the New Testament example with Paul, Paul never focused on divine healing as a major. And this movement that we see came out of the 1940s, even earlier with John Dowie. The main focus was on healing. And most of these healing ministries were more sham than they were real. There might have been some people healed, as I mentioned, but Paul never made a big deal out of healing, or he never gave it more emphasis than, say, the gift of tongues or word of knowledge or anything else. It was all lumped into the gifts of the Spirit. And the major focus was supposed to be Christ and salvation and the gospel. And we'll see that in the scripture that Paul only focused on that. I would say probably 99.98% of the people ever prayed for really most of them did not get healed. You had that one here or there that got healed. And you hear them claim, we've got really documented evidence from doctors that we were healed, that the people, thousands were healed, but you never see them produce the documents. They just always say that. So a lot of us just speaking things that really weren't true, of how the success of the meetings were. But Paul, when people tried to make him a great power of God after he healed a person, somebody stood up, it says in Acts 14:10, a man that was crippled got up and walked. And then when the people saw that, they lifted up their voices and said, the gods are come down in the likeness of men. And that's exactly what we see in Avak and William Branham's ministry. They wanted to say God was in them in the likeness of men. Now, they made a big deal of it, but let's look how Paul did it. They tried to make Paul and Barnabas these gods. And then as soon as they heard about it, it says, which when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of that, they tore their clothes. They ran out in the streets among the people and just cried out, saying, why are you doing these things? Why are you trying to make us big? We're men of like passions like you, and we're asking you to turn to the living God, not to a gift of healing that I've got or that God gave me. It's turn to the living God. And they even state that, in times past, you walked in your own ways, but now he's trying to get you to turn to the gospel. So the whole thing was to turn to the gospel of Christ, repentance, and serving Christ and not your own self anymore. So we see a huge difference in the healing revival of the 40s and really what Paul, if you were preaching the gospel of Paul, you wouldn't be majoring on healing like these men did.
Yeah, I agree. You mentioned the book by Roy Wehrmanchuk, and I have a copy of it that it was sent to me by him. Whenever I began researching the early years of Latter Rain, he contacted me because he was researching Branham at the same time. I should have brought it in here to show, but I also have a book from him on William Branham. He was writing the book on Branham, and we both came to this side story about the same time. And so we're going back and forth with the research, and I'm sharing things that I found with him and he with me, and he ended up writing this book based off of that. I've often considered of going back and writing a book showing the importance of Avak Hagopian to latter rain and ultimately to the NAR, because this Branham said that angels were messengers, and then when he describes his fictional alleged angel, he is describing this character. If you go look at the newspapers,
that's right. Yes.
He is fully describing this guy, and so Roy and I both we came to similar conclusions that Branham knew this guy a lot more intimately, and we had not yet seen the photograph of Branham with him. And later, after, it may have been even after this book, we came across that. Roy is also the guy who found out that William Branham was using a false middle name for the revivals. He's the one that sent me the the GI record of Marvin. I never even thought to look at it. I should have looked for it, but that's the first thing he did, and he was like, "Oh my gosh, have you seen this?" But anyway, this is an excellent book. I recommend it. It's called Avak Hagopian: From Fame to Failure, and like I said, I know that many people they will never have heard this name, and they will never have connected it with latter rain and all of the various movements that came after. But Branham said an angel is a messenger, and this guy was an alleged faith healer. You could almost say that Branham was building him up to be an angel for the church age. And we don't have the recordings that have been erased from our history before 1947. And many of them in 1947 and 48 are missing. They're so-called quote-unquote missing. I suspect that he's probably in a lot of those recordings that we don't have access to have. So Branham may have even been touting him as an angel messenger to his prophet and setting, prior to the latter rain, setting up apostles, prophets, etc. We don't know what William Branham did, but we can see from the newspapers and from Branham's own statements that very, very wealthy people were setting up this faith healing ministry with Branham and Avak. And he says the same men who sent Avak to this area sent me. So he's saying literally that, if you know the history, the Kardashian family is sponsoring it. You've got the Kardashians, the Shakarians. Demas Shakarian founded the Full Gospel Businessman, which is deeply connected to many different things. We'll get into that later. But anyway, all of this started in 1947, prior to William Branham's explosion into fame. And this guy was actually, Avak Hagopian, was actually more famous for a brief period of time. So it gets really interesting as we get into this.
Yeah, it was interesting that those ministries started about the same time. Branham got started just right after Avak had got to the country. His national fame started. But that's really what pushed Branham into fame, was Avak's diminishing, because Avak failed to heal Vaughn or Killian. After he was brought over here, his dad had great faith in Avak because he'd heard about his stories in Iran, how he had these gifts. So he paid lots of money to get him over there. And believe it or not, I read where, I think it was in Roy's book there, he paid $250,000 already to try to get his son well. If you take that and translate that into today's money, you're probably talking about millions of dollars. And no effect on his son there. So when Avak failed to really produce healing, he actually said, within 2 weeks, I'll have your son healed. And he never could produce the healing. And he claimed he gave certain excuses because, it was maybe too many people around him, or he couldn't get off and pray. And so his fame diminished right at the time Branham's took off. And at the time, Branham was demonstrating, so-called great powers of God, and people just flocked to it. Because people were flocking to the homes out there in California, in Palm Springs, where Avak was. They were already flocking out there and sending thousands of letters a day to seeking the healing. So there was many ailments, I guess, in the United States about that time, with medical science not having been advanced like it is today. But there's always plenty of sick people, and there's always people that, if there's a hope of getting well, they certainly want to go to it. So we saw that. I thought about this podcast. What could you call it? And I guess, the subtitle to this thing could be Narcissism, because there is a certain amount of narcissism in these leaders, and it's defined as a self-centered personality style, characterized as having an excessive preoccupation with oneself and one's own needs at the expense of others often. And there's an essay in 1913 called The God Complex. Ernest Jones wrote down what he considered extreme narcissism as a character trait. So narcissism is a personality disorder, actually. It's actually a disorder like any other psychological disorder people have. And I believe there's a certain amount of that, a certain amount of it in all of us, but there's a certain great amount in these men. He described people, this guy, Ernest Jones, as with the God complex as being aloof, self-important, overconfident, autoerotic, inaccessible. So there you go, self-admiring exhibitionists with fantasies of omnipotence and omniscience. He observed that these people had a high need for uniqueness. I think that pretty much describes, these ministers that we're talking about. They wanted to be unique. They had a high sense of self-importance, like I'm the prophet of God. They might not overtly state it many times, but many times they did. But they wanted you to know that, hey, I am in the Scripture. These Scriptures are written about me. And we see Malachi 4 being one of the main ones where it was openly proclaimed, I'm Malachi 4. And people began to believe that. So as long as that's what they were after, and they had this God complex, so I think we could call this narcissism in a way. It was also, narcissism is a grandiose sense of self-importance, a constant need for admiration. That's another thing, that an excessive desire for attention. So these men, they grew up with this personality trait, and because of their excessive desire for that attention that they really craved, they sought to get it, and they had these abilities. And we'll see these abilities really is what separates them from the rest, as he's being charismatic and being able to sway people. There's a lot there, but these people engage in manipulative and controlling behavior sometimes in their relationships. So it's every narcissist, even Roy writes this in his book, says to be surrounded and adored by the masses is a secret wish of many of the natural aspiration of every narcissist. But only those who have a certain charisma, talent, appearance, or in the worst case, power, receive the attention on a permanent basis. So Avak had a godlike homage. He tended to look like Christ, as we said, that he was. And even Roy writes in his book that he's the prefigure of the angel that appeared to Branham. So right about the time Branham was talking about this angel that appeared, whereas we know before that time he only talked about a vision in 1945 when he got started with his healing ministry. He didn't talk about some angel in human form. And right about the time he met Avak, we see him describing a man that perfectly looks like Avak, with the white robe, the olive complexion, the long hair to his shoulders. And that's what Roy writes in his book. He's probably very much maybe describing Avak. And he writes it's the ancient Greeks described narcissism as an arrogance which brings the person to the verge of social failure. And we see that happening when you get so narcissistic that you are hurting men and hurting others in your ministry. And we find that people tend to shy away from that, but there's always a balance there. They try to remain powerful. So Frida Lindsay writes in her book here that Branham loved flatteries. She writes in her diary Secrets that in early days, Branham was very much messed up in his doctrine, having had some strange doctrines. Gordon actually helped straighten him out, in the early days. That's the recordings we don't really have available. All those recordings prior to Gordon Lindsay working with Branham trying to straighten him out, it would be very nice to have all those, because then you see what the ministry was really like in the early days before it sounded more Christian. Because in the early days, Frida Lindsay said it was bordering on the occult. And when we saw some of those recordings we went through last time about the bracelet and the things that he would do about saying, I can just look at a person and uncross their eyes, all that kind of things is really doesn't sound like the kind of healing that God gave out to men. And Branham was such I won't say narcissist, but such a feeling of importance about himself. They would schedule meetings, and she said he wouldn't even show up. He said, well, I just didn't know I had to drive that far. So his feeling of importance was such that he wouldn't even bother to show up for the meeting that they spent thousands of dollars to set up for him sometimes. And he even said, I'm going off the field after his physical breakdown and get a job as my game warding job back in Indiana. And And about the magazine, Gordon asked him about what's going to happen to the Voice of Healing, and he just said, "Well, that's yours." So that was your idea, and that's what she writes in her diary. So it just goes to show that these men have a greater sense of their self, and they seek to gain the following, but they always have that sense of importance about themselves, and they crave it, and that's what drives them. More so sometimes than money or fame or popularity, they're driven by that need to fulfill that need in their life.
Right, I would agree. Narcissism, if you study cults and study cult leaders, they all display various levels of narcissistic personality disorder. And you can go on the internet and you can type in what are the signs of narcissism, and you'll see, a list of characteristics of personalities that suddenly, if you're in a destructive group, suddenly you're going to read this and think, oh, wait a minute, that's describing this guy that we're following. And it's very common if you look across all of them. But, getting to Avak Hagopian's story coming to America, when you first see it, it's really weird because they're bringing him in from, I think they said his last major revival was Egypt, if I remember correctly. I'd have to go back and refresh my memory, but immediately prior to him coming to the United States, regardless of what country he is in, he had worldwide fame. So this was a man who was globally famous, not just in a specific region. And these very, very wealthy owners of vineyards out in Palm Springs brought him over to the country. And when he landed, it was, I'm trying to picture somebody as famous as that back then, and I'm struggling to pull up a name because his plane landed and suddenly this throng of people come to greet him. And everywhere he goes throughout the United States, it's very, it reminds you of how a stage act would tour through the United States back then. He did not just land and then go directly to where he was called to be. He would go to different cities and build up this big hype over him. So there was an element of showmanship that came with this. So if you think of the NAR, you think of the way that they do these showmanship ministries, these lights, cameras, glitter, action, Cadillacs, all of this. Well, this guy had it, and he had it prior to getting to Palm Springs. He had built up such a recognition in the United States that by the time he landed in Palm Springs, there were people flocking by, I think one of the counts I read was over 10,000 people. And Palm Springs was inundated with people who, there was not enough housing and in hotels to keep them all. So these wealthy homes and these very rich people were having to bring some of these people in their homes because they're out there in the elements. They didn't even have food. They did not have enough food to supply them. So I read one article where it described the mess that was created by all of this, and they were having to bring in mobile hot dog stands and sell people hot dogs because there just wasn't enough food. There wasn't enough restaurants to hold them all. It was not designed to handle a 10,000 people throng to come into the area, just simply put. But he brought with him all of this glamour and stage persona that it set the stage for what was to come. And if you compare what happened with Avak in that period of time, whenever he's just getting established in Los Angeles, to the way that the faith healers, the alleged faith healers in the Latter Rain movement presented themselves, they would land in a city, build up this hype, and then go to the next city and take the hype with them. This guy was literally a prototype for the carnival that was about to ensue. And the fact that they brought William Branham, who would lead that revival, he spearheaded the Latter Rain revivals. The fact that they brought Branham into this mix shows that there was some sort of strategy involved in setting all of this up, because the man who led it was also working with the guy who's creating all of this hype. And again, I wish we had those records. I wish we had those audio recordings, because if you look back at the dates, there were a lot more recordings than what we have access to in 1947. So if we had it, we could probably see how the Latter Rain movement came to be shaped by all of this.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Avak was just the beginning of the whole show that was fixing to break out upon the nation. And like I say, had Avak been a little bit successful and had something had happened in Von Archelian's life that might have showed a healing that had taken place, I mean, he would have been having worldwide fame as all these other ministers. He'd have actually been the spearhead of all the revival instead of Branham, perhaps. But there were men ready to jump on board with this, as we'll see. They saw lots of money, and I think Tados, Kardashian, and two others, they went, as soon as he failed to heal Vaughn, they took up Avak's cause and went on. And Clem Davies was also involved in the mix. Clem Davies was known as a like one of those fascist white supremacists, and he wanted to use Avak more to get his message across, but he also saw the money that was to be made there. But eventually, with Clem Davies being involved, taking Avak around the country, because Clem Davies would do these tours, and it would be a patriotic tour to take people around the country on a train and promote anti-communism and to try to fight communism at the time. And so that's what Clem Davies was about. And also Clem Davies had written books about the Aryan race being the supreme race and so forth. So he was involved with the Klan and KKK as well. And that's what turned Tados Kardashian off, and they backed away from Avak for a time, or forever, I guess, as while Clem Davies took him around. But while Clem Davies was taken around, interesting, Clem Davies got sick, and he had to back away from the tour because he actually got sick. So I guess the healing powers of Avak didn't make him well enough to continue with the tour. But people flocked to that, and they actually paid a lot of money. They had to pay, in those days, $665 or so to join that train. But getting back to the narcissism characteristic too, another thing that goes along with that is charisma. And we see all these men from A.A. Allen to T.L. Osborne, Branham, all those men you could list there, put them all together. They definitely have charisma, because you take some of the men that have come on the scene today, that's probably one of the first things that's looked for. They're not looking for some humble man that they're teaching the word and really expounding the gospel. They want somebody with great, charisma. And charisma is just really not even a talent. Sometimes it says in Roy's book there, it's just an unearned aura involving a phenomena that's just in the person. So the person is born with it, and you're either born with it or not. And I don't think we should exalt one person over another just because they have a more charisma. Charisma has its place, but it's not to dominate other people with your charisma, and especially in these types of ministries. But instead of overt narcissism, I think, in Branham's ministry, they also describe a covert narcissism. That's coupled with a lack of self-esteem and with high self-claims. I think that pretty well describes, that's from Paul Wink, Two Faces of Narcissism, from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 1991. Overt narcissism expresses itself in a striving for dominance, self-importance. So I think that doesn't particularly describe Avak and Branham, but I think it more along in the covert side of narcissism. You tend to have a lack of self-esteem, but you have high self-claims in that. Charisma requires no personal performance or qualifications. So, you can be the worst Bible teacher in the world, such as we see, Branham had a very hard time teaching the Bible correctly, but your charisma actually carries you along. You don't have to be anything. It gives them social advantages. It gives them, they receive attention and admiration and trust even without even earning it, the way the majority of us have to do, with people. And they're usually surrounded by a group of loyal admirers. They have a core group of people there. And what this author called this was seed capital. They already have money in the bank there in their personality. So all paths are open to them, whether it be politics, religion, business, or entertainment industry. And I think that's what we see in the NAR is there's men born with charisma, and the ones that go into the religious path, they get involved in this NAR, and they rise up to be the apostles and prophets over others. But it's that charisma that carries them. They don't have to be accurate in their prophecies, or they don't have to be a good Bible teacher. They just have to join the train that's moving, and then all paths are open to them. Now, those that get into politics, of course, they're also or business. They just have these advantages that most of us don't have. Avak chose the religious path, as did Branham. Religion, he said in this book, does not require any special gifts or high level of education or talents. Just a simple spiritual revelation is all you need. So anybody out there wanting to start a new religious group, get your spiritual revelation. If you got some charisma, you can probably form a group or a following.
Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the new Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support. I want to get back to something you said previously, though. You mentioned Clem Davies, which he is going to have to be another side story that we do, because as weird as it sounds, like Avak Hagopian, that name also helped create what became. Without this combination, this group of men that were gathered together, the Shakarians, the Kardashians, Branham, Avak, Clem Davies, and some other Pentecostal men, which we'll get into also later, that had a very stage act centered version of Pentecostalism, and would later lead the Branham campaigns. We'll get into that later. Without this group of men, it would not have shaped the NAR. It would not have shaped Latter Rain and later the NAR. So Clem Davies was a well-known, widely publicized white supremacist from up in, I think it was Vancouver, and he was deeply embedded into Christian identity. And so when you think of this group of men, you've got Branham, who was mentored by the second in command of the Klan, who would become a leader in Christian identity. Clem Davies, who's in Christian identity. Gordon Lindsay became Branham's first, or not first, but one of his significant stage campaign managers. He was involved in Christian identity. And then you bring all of the other men that we've been discussing, Wesley Swift, Gerald L.K. Smith, all of this conglomeration of people. Christian identity was front and center. And so I tried to look last week and part of this week to find links between Avak and Christian identity, and there isn't a lot of information existing out there. But I suspect that he was part of that movement as well, because they were building a Christian identity stage act. I mean, pure, plain, and simple. You don't invite people like Clem Davies to the game, and William Branham, too, who's all these white supremacy guys. You don't invite them to be part of this party, if you will, if they're not of the same mindset. And so it shows the mindset that was being established, and they were setting up for this stage act to go on a road tour. And that's where, when I mentioned the photograph that we have of Branham with Avak Hagopian, that's actually where that photograph came from. It was part of the road show. I want to say that one was it might have been Tampa, somewhere in Florida. They were holding revivals out there. And some magazine, which I have not yet found where it was published, but some magazine has a photograph of William Branham, Avak Hagopian, and another gentleman that we'll bring into the story later. But they set up the stage act, and they went across the country with it. The interesting part of all of this, I've got newspaper articles. In fact, as we're talking, I'm pulling up on the screen to refresh my memory, but the newspapers from coast to coast followed this story, and they show these photographs of Avak reaching down and praying for the sick Archelian boy, man, I guess he was at this age. And they followed the story of the prayer and the healer. And you can find it all throughout the United States. If you just go to newspapers.com, type in Avak Hagopian, you're going to find the widely publicized prayer for the sick. That part gets published. Where it gets interesting is, by the time that the story is ending, which we'll get into later, by the time you want to see the outcome, well, what happened to this guy, the newspapers just blatantly stop covering it. So you don't actually ever see the result. All you see is the intent. And that's where it gets even more interesting, because the results don't match the intentions at all.
Yeah, you're so right. I mean, that was a very good explanation there of the whole thing. But these men that were gifted and had charisma, a lot of times they had to have handlers. So that's what we see is it's the handlers who are behind the scenes that want to start the stage show, that they can use these men for their own personal gain. And I think it was even written in David Harrell's book, All Things Are Possible, that, of course, Branham got in trouble with the IRS, but he claimed only $8,000 on his tax return, and the others were claiming $80,000. Now, I'll bet that $8,000 was very small compared to what he really got, because the IRS claimed Branham owed a lot more money than just, those few taxes that probably he reported. But if men were claiming $80,000, you can probably bet that he was making the same money too, just not reporting it. And that's why he got into trouble. And actually, in Frida Lindsay's book, she mentions the case of the IRS and mentions that Gordon warned Branham, says, you need to be reporting this income. And she said he warned him way before the IRS got involved. And so when he had his tax case, Branham came crying back to Gordon saying, what do I do? What do I do? But yeah, that's very true. So Avak, it was about 8 years old, and there's a lot of parallels here. As we mentioned earlier, this is a parallel ministry between him and Branham. And I don't know if they just come up with these stories to make their fames to get started, but this is how they get started. Avak was about 8 years old. He was tending sheep. He had his first divine vision, and with it came the gift of healing, he claimed. And it's also claimed that he worked his first miracle at the age of 12. Now, this came from the stories told about him in Iran. So by the time it got to the United States, you're hearing all these stories about a person, and then all of a sudden his persona is just blown up because so many people are saying he works miracles, he heals the sick. And there's a lot of people that stand behind the stories that were told. It claimed he worked a miracle at age 12 when a drought struck the country, and he actually prayed for rain, and it rained. So he was kind of like an Elijah figure praying for rain. It also says he was illiterate until adulthood and not attended school, very much in parallel with what Branham had. In another writing, it actually said Avak was very literate, so and not really uneducated. But that was one of the things. He was very illiterate. I don't know anything, but I just know the Bible. Another vision was given to him. He was working as a goldsmith at the time in Iran, and it was said the entire Bible was revealed to him. And there's even another vision that he had where two white doves came. And we know Branham mentions doves and visions a whole lot too. He heard the voice of his deceased mother, and the other voice of the dove came from Jesus Christ himself. And they told him to preach the word and heal those who have faith, given the ability, and he was also given the ability to see inside people. So we see these gifts about seeing inside people, reading their minds and so forth. It really started with Avak because he claimed to have that ability. He said from then on, he was able not only to recognize the seed of godliness in every human being, but also to see people's physical ailments and illnesses. So this is exactly the type of ministry that Branham had as well, being able to see inside people's lives, their physical ailments and illnesses, as well as the seed of godliness. So, some people even claim Branham knew the seed that was in you, whether you were seed of the serpent or whether you were seed of God. That's kind of amazing that that God would even give somebody the ability to do that. I don't believe that he does. But Avak told his audiences that vision that after his mother had passed away. But interestingly, it actually contradicted other statements made. So you see, even in Avak's ministry, he couldn't tell the stories right. It contradicted other stories which were made while his mother was still alive about that vision. So we see very contradictory statements even being mentioned in these articles. And another very interesting vision that he had, and I don't know if Branham ever read about these visions or knew about that through his contact with Avak, but it says he added visions of Old Testament prophets years later, and even had a vision about angels, even a hand with a sword. So that's very much in line with the sword that came in Sabino Canyon or out there in Arizona. At the age of 16, he claimed to have been visited by a supernatural being, endowed with complete knowledge of the Bible at that time and a gift of healing. And Roy writes in his book, that's very similar to the experience related by Brother Branham. And more visions followed after that. He was presented as the temple of wisdom, whose source of knowledge he could access at any time. So he had infinite wisdom and knowledge he could access. From then on, it said Avak had the ability to read people's minds. And there was a story about one 2-year-old son of a woman that fell into a water cistern. He had supposedly drowned, and then Avak looked at him for 20 minutes, and he came back to life. But eventually, Avak joined this doctor. This doctor claimed that he was healed of hard of hearing by Avak, and this doctor and him joined together. But after he joined this doctor in Iran, I don't know what year it was, but sometime before he came to the U.S., it's very similar to what Branham was into. The Tehran-based Iranian Society of Experimental Spirit Science, they heard about the high number of healings, and so it brought to their attention Avak. And so eventually they got involved with the spiritualism over there in Iran because of that. So we see spiritualism, combined with these so-called visions from God and all kind of intertwined. And you would think that Avak would stay away from that, but they actually got involved in spiritualism over there in Iran. And because of these healings, the spiritualism were very much interested in that. But it was around 1946 that the retired millionaire, Krikor Arkelian, brought him here. And Krikor said it was only as a last resort, because like I say, he spent, $250,000 already, on his son's healing. So it was really a last resort thing. And Avak said he could do it if the patient only believed in his gift. So another way that Avak presented himself is that if you can believe me, believe in my gift, you'll get healed. Same way Branham said, the angel told him that if you can believe me and get the people to believe in what you're saying about the visit of the angel, they'll get healed. So very much different than probably how the Bible teaches how you should believe healing. And so the newspapers were all abuzz with Avak's visit. So that's how his fame all started. It just started with that visit to Krikor Arkelian and how he got his start.
Right. There's so many similarities. I mean, we could probably do a whole episode on just the similarities between the two. But the big takeaways for me is the way that these men were manipulating the crowds. They wanted people to see that there was not just a single presence. It initially started with Avak, but then they brought other people into the mix. They brought Branham, and they're trying to show that this was the formation of a movement. This was something that was igniting I don't know what the word that they use because we don't have access to the recordings, but in the NAR terms, they would say this was igniting a revival. And these are the spiritual leaders of the revival. That's how it would be said in today's words. And they established the notion that the people could connect to God through these men as mediators. And they also set the precedent of setting the agenda of the movement to focus on the experience rather than the outcome. If you look at these newspapers, they don't really care so much that what these men are saying claiming that they can do isn't happening. They want the experience. So people are coming in throngs to see these healers. And there's a point, it gets mundane reading through all of the newspaper articles on Avak, but if you read through the fine details of the months that were spent out there, quote unquote, healing this young man, Avak gets tired of the crowds, and they're all coming. You can tell they're probably asking him, why isn't he healed? You said that you're healing him, and nothing is happening. It gets to the point where all these people are coming for their own prayer, for their own situations, and Avak is saying that I only have the I don't know what the word he used, but basically I only have the energy to heal for a limited period of time per day. And that window of time gets shorter and shorter and shorter as time progresses, because he's getting tired of these people. And the more time that he gives himself to the people, the more people that are going to believe his claims that they're going to be healed, and the more people that aren't healed. So if you expand that window, your chance of success is greatly diminished. So they close the window and they say only a little bit of, a few of the people for a few minutes, basically. And if you look what happened in the early years of Latter Rain, Branham would say the same thing. You probably remember the word Branham used, but basically the stamina goes out of him. He says, I can only do a few at a time. And then there comes a point when I think it was about the time that the wireless earpiece was invented. There comes a point where he says, now I'll be able to do this for hours on end. But prior to that point, he says, I can only do it a little bit, and then I get just so weak they have to carry me off the stage. Well, there's a reason for this, right? If you stay up there, the more people that you tell are healed, well, they go home and they're not healed, those people are going to get very, very angry. And so Avak and these men set the stage for the experience is more important than the outcome. The healer is more important than the God that heals. And the movement is a move of God where you can gain access to God through these men. And that was the precedent that was set. And again, look at the NAR today, look at all of the movements leading up to the NAR. It's always about the mediators between God and man, which is in direct violation if you read passages like, Paul's letters to Timothy. There is no mediator between God and man. Well, these guys did not want to set that precedent because there's no money in that. They want to set the precedent, go for the mediator, because that mediator can collect your money.
That's exactly right. They made a lot of money and continue to this day making tons of money. We see these ministries that are built all on the prosperity gospel, just buying $50 million jet planes so they can fly around and enjoy themselves on religion, the money that it makes. But it continues to make to this day, millions and millions of dollars. You were right. These experiences people had in these meetings, Branham will say, I get very weak, virtues going out of me. They would only do about, he would only call about 10 or so to the stage. And I guess even in Roy's book, he said they passed out the prayer cards, and Branham used those as sort of almost like a fortune telling, which was in what we know, we call it the word of knowledge and so forth, that we believed it was a gift. But if you that's 10 is about all you could probably memorize at a time if you were using the prayer cards, for that purpose. So, but the services themselves were very powerful in the sense that music, swayed people. The experience that you had prior to the man ever stepping onto the platform, the people were primed and ready. So the few that he would call to the platform and then supposedly get weak and have to be taken off, he would do a mass prayer for everyone. And so that's how it was staged, and it was very effective. Avak, very similar to what Branham would always say and what Bosworth and all them would teach. He said about talking about people's healing, it depended on the patient's degree of faith. And then another statement about Vaughn, he said, I'm sure I can cure him. So on both sides of his mouth, he's saying, well, it depends on your faith. And then he says, I'm sure I can cure you. So they believed that they could do it, but then if it failed, the person's faith failed. It wasn't me. Avak also is known to have been said, have faith in me and you will be healed. And then when the prayer of this lady that he was praying for after he told that to her, it did not bring any change to her. He said after that, I must do it in my own time, in my own way. So they always have some kind of excuse for the person that's not healed. Some newspapers quoted Avak as saying, no matter what your nationality or religion, keep faith in me and you will get well. Now, in Branham's early days, there's a sermon in 1947 about November called The Angel of God. We took a lot from that, and there's a lot said in that, and that's probably why we don't have a lot of the earlier recordings, because who knows what really went on behind us in those meetings. I would love to really know. So Branham was talking about the miracle line. If you ever go back to those earliest recordings, he tended to want to display the power and such that he would create these miracle lines. People were asking him, put all the cripples up there and let's see you heal every one. He said there'll be a miracle line for nothing but cripples. And then when the cripples weren't getting healed, he claimed that, he was only doing it by the permissive will of God, not the divine will of God. God permitted it for a time, but he had to quit all that because nobody was getting healed. And he even said that he gave another excuse. There were some deaf people that came before him, and he said the vibrations in his hand left, but then he said immediately it came back and the person wasn't healed. And he said he some of his quotes here, I'll mention first that when he got rebuked by the angel, he said he stood in the hotel room. There was a big rainbow and mist in the room, and standing there before those people and told me I was confining too much of this gift of healing to working miracles. And he said, but then he also said, I've never seen all my life till this afternoon anything laid before the gift of healing without it being healed. So he was already having issues with success in his ministry right there in 1947 about people that weren't getting healed. And so that's how he told this. He even talked about the deaf people. He said, out of this entire meeting, there's been several deaf people come by here. And after I called that, even the vibrations wouldn't even leave. He said, that's right. It would leave and then it'd take a hold of them and come back again. He said it was just a witness. So what he was trying to do is blame the failures of the healings on this miracle line that was created, that he claimed that, God permitted it for a time, but now I'm not doing that anymore. I'm only going to do it the way the angel tells me to do it. And that's where he started bringing fewer and fewer people before him, because eventually he, as we know, left the field out of collapse from trying to pray for thousands of people and one by one. And so no man could withstand all that. So he also says, remember, don't come to me and ask me to perform any more miracles anymore. Now, God has permitted it to this time. And he said, every one of you is a witness. Is that right? He wanted to keep everything in the prayer line. He says, everybody thinks everything's a miracle line, as we told you, or asked you rather. And here's interesting. He's actually praying in this, and we got kind of a blank spot on tape here, but he's actually praying to God at this time. And he prayed to God this way. And we told you, he said, or asked you rather, if you would bring everyone here and heal them, then I would continue on and have nothing but miracle lines. But if you did not heal the people in miracle line, then it would be a witness that you were not going to heal the people by letting them pass by and believe. He said, now the angel of God told me it would come to pass. They wouldn't believe unless there was a miracle. And he says, your words have been proved true. So that's generally how he spun that at the time, because of these failures in healing that were occurring. And then later on, just 20 days later, he's got the miracle line again. He says, and especially this afternoon, to you who shall come in this miracle line, don't you dare come unless you promise God with all your heart and mean it that you will serve him the rest of your life. So the people were very primed for these miracle lines because they really believed in his powers. Same way they believed in Avak's powers prior to him coming to the United States. It really primes your adrenaline, your emotions, and you're expecting really something to happen through this man of God. And he becomes the great power of God, as we mentioned. And that's not what Paul wanted to present before the people, is that I'm some great power of God and have this miracle line. And it's all about healing. Really it was supposed to be about the salvation of the soul, as we mentioned. And he talks about in that same service, talk about the child come together. He said he healed the deaf girl, and she said, now the child is healed, and he tried to talk to her. He said he couldn't even yell at her or beat my hands together, and she couldn't even hear. And then he cast it forth again, and then in the end, he said, I just left the child alone. He couldn't even touch her to be healed. He says she couldn't even hear me when another man he couldn't hear when he beat his hand behind him. So he talked about those failures there, and he had to change his methods, or otherwise he might have been with the same reputation Avak had, where his popularity really dropped off. They were going to have to change something in a hurry, so they changed the way they were doing the meetings. And like I say, we don't have those early recordings. We just have these few, and we're very fortunate to have these ones in 1947 even, but there was plenty more recordings prior to that, as we know. But it's just amazing what we could find on those tapes if we only was able to go back and hear them. But during that time in the 1930s and 40s, there was other people that rose up. There was a man that called himself the reincarnation of the prophet Isaiah. He was quickly forgotten though after a while. And there was other men that rose up in his stead. But so people were very primed in those days for these great men to rise up it was just a special time in American history, I guess, and it was just prime time for these ministries. But men that wanted to make the money, they saw the opportunities there. So I'll talk more about that in a minute.
There's definitely money to be made. That's pure, plain and simple. In fact, if you go look at some of the quotes that William Branham mentions, he mentions being with Avak, and he mentions being with the people who sponsored him, which is obviously the Kardashians, the Shakarians. And Branham formed a long-term relationship with the Full Gospel Businessmen, which was ran by Dima Shakarian. And it's funny because he mentions that they tell him, we gave Avak a Cadillac. We'd like to give you one too. We want to give you some money like we're giving Avak some money. And Branham says, no, I can't picture myself doing this. And then we've got photographs where he accepted the Cadillac from these people. So there was definitely money flowing through it, and how they used it, it remains to be seen, but you can see some expensive watches and some other things enter Branham's ministry after this point. But you're right, there was a point in time in which Avak's ministry diminished, and that's where this gets really interesting, because as Branham goes out there to work to heal this sick boy, the boy never gets healed. You can go back and you can read the newspapers. It's difficult to find because his failure in healing is not publicized, but the prayer for his healing is coast to coast. And so this entire throng is here. The boy's being prayed for. Nobody cares that there is no healing that comes from this. And that's what set the stage for this whole thing. And then whatever happens, we don't have those recordings, we don't have the record. Something happens where the focus shifts from Avak Hagopian to William Branham. And after that shift is made, you can watch the newspapers, all of this throng just basically starts following Branham away from Avak. And they follow Branham well up into, you can find similar articles in Canada, when Branham goes up into Canada and sweeps across from the east to the west in Canada and sparks what would become the latter rain revivals. You can see articles in the newspapers where those cities are inundated from people from the United States, and they can't support them. There's not housing, there's not hotels enough to handle them all. So they're going into houses of people who are in like-minded faith up in Canada. And the throng has left Avak. And so I found one article, I'll try to find it for the video version of this podcast, but I found one article where it's just really kind of sad when you think about it. Avak he leaves the Archelians and he goes up north to hold a revival up there after having toured through the United States carrying a throng with him. And then he gets off the plane, and I want to say the article, if I'm remembering correctly, I want to say there was only like 3 people to greet him. All of the rest of them had gone with William Branham, and we know based off of what we're seeing here that if the Shakarians were sponsoring him and the connections with Full Gospel Businessmen continued for the entire rest of William Branham's life, it's likely they were involved to some extent. We don't know what extent, but it went across Canada and then back into the United States in a very carnival-like fashion. If you read the newspapers, signs, wonders, miracles, just like they advertise today. But the throng of people had left Avak, and again, you cannot have a latter rain in the form that it existed without Avak, because he's the one that collected the initial group of people. Then they went to Branham, left Avak behind, and then that spread throughout the globe. All of those people spreading this movement as though this is a movement by God, but they had lost the focus of, did it actually work? Did the guy actually get healed that sparked the whole thing? And he did not.
Yeah, all that you said was correct there. So I want to mention this real quick. Tom Kardashian, William Perumian, they realized how much money could be made. So all that you're saying there is just absolutely right. It's all about the money there. And Avak was reported to be under their wing at that time. And the paper reported it like this. He says, a public relations officer issues a bulletin that the first day's take, he said, beg pardon, love offering amounted to $2,922. That was in the Los Angeles Times in 1947, September. So $2,922.47 is $41,214 in today's money. So that's quite a sum of money, $41,000 a day taken in. Clem Davies came on the scene about that time because, of course, he saw the money to be made. And believe it or not, Clem Davies had already sponsored a Hindu guru. So Clem Davies wasn't about Christianity. It was about whoever he could build up before the people that would make him a lot of money. Christianity tended to be the majority religion in the United States. So Clem Davies saw that as a way on his gravy train, in which he actually had a train that went around the United States carrying people to promote this. But Clem Davies became his new sponsor and companion in the USA, and they started holding these mass healing events. Tom Kardashian was actually Avak's interpreter. So Tom Kardashian had his two other folks there with him, and they were all making this money. Clem Davies was asking for visa extensions for Avak and actually got it. But Clem Davies, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, noted in a memo that Avak was in contact with Clem Davies, who had close ties to various fascist groups and was together with Avak suspected of collecting funds illegally. So that was something else reported. And in these healing revivals, a lot of newspapers would question about healing. I think we even had one in Branham's ministry where the newspapers were investigating. They want to know, are people really getting healed? And they asked Bosworth to stand up and ask the people to come forward, anybody that got healed. And they did. And it was said in the newspapers, not one person even stepped forward that was healed in the meeting. And then so they brought up this excuse, well, people, when they get healed, they just go home. They don't stay for the meetings. So that was one way. Here in the Canadian press, there was Tinkham that wrote this article, I guess, said there was no medical evidence that any of the 3,500 people that Avak had treated had benefited from his prayers and laying on of hands. So they announced we healed all these thousands of people, but there was no medical evidence that anybody got healed. And the train finally pulled into Los Angeles in November of 1947, and his tour came to an end. That's when Tom Kardashian quit following him, because Tom Kardashian wanted to build a temple for Avak. And, I guess to have him a place to camp out and do his services right there in Los Angeles. But Tom Kardashian then backed away. And the real reason it says that he distanced himself from Avak after the tour was he was assisted by Clem Davies, and he thought they were frauds. So that's why he basically backed away. So Avak became very unpopular in the West because of his failure to heal, and he eventually moved east to Miami, and that's where a lot of the interesting things started. We're not going to have time to go through it on this podcast, I know, but he distanced himself physically from the West Coast because of his failure to completely cure Vaughn, and he started his ministry there. And an interesting reflection that was noted in the book here by Roy, I guess he said, Avak had already reached a point where his critical self-reflection was no longer possible. He believed in his divine election, separation from the masses. The admiration he received from his followers only confirmed his belief in himself. Doubt and criticism of his abilities were questioning his dignity, something he equated with disbelief. Anyone who did not believe in him was not a true Christian. It is this inner logic of his, if one can speak of logic, which explains his behavior from then on out. So that's very much like what we see in the message. If you disbelieve, you're questioning, or questioning the abilities of Branham. Say you're seen as not even being a true Christian, and that's how you get kicked out of the movement, basically. So it's about this time when he got to Miami that's when Clem Davies was with him, and then he was visited by William Branham in Jeffersonville. And William Branham used the meeting with Avak for his own publicity, putting it in the Voice of Healing magazine, and that's generally how it was used. Clem Davies used it for his furtherance of his boasting and getting more money. But that was about the time William Branham had some meetings with Little David Walker, which y'all mentioned before, and the spectacular show they were showing there about him levitating off the ground and all those things. And William Branham actually viewed Avak as an inspiration for some time. And it also said, as we mentioned before, it took him as the visual model of the angel that met with him. So Avak kept trying to get extensions of his visa, and eventually had to leave the country, living in Cuba for some time. And this time is where it gets interesting with Avak. Like I said, there were women that came into his life, And he eventually broke up a marriage and costing this one man millions of dollars to finally get his marriage dissolved. But actually, these women were set up close to Avak, and they actually became his mistresses, and he actually called them temple brides. So eventually he got off into immorality. It's not spoken of very much, and nothing's ever said about it, but it was kept under the cover. But we see that being a part of a lot of these ministries. It eventually creeps in, and these men, they don't ever get married, but they do have a harem. Now, Avak, eventually being in Cuba for that time, wanted to come back to the United States because that's where he wanted his home to be. So eventually he married this 16-year-old girl, one of the women in the U.S. that was supporting his ministry, married her daughter. And that marriage was believed just to be for the sake of him getting to the U.S. to become a citizen, because once you get married, you can become a citizen. So he married this 16-year-old girl and became a U.S. citizen. Then eventually that marriage was annulled for obvious reasons, and he stayed in the U.S. from then on out and had his ministry. But he did have his harem. It is mentioned in that book. We won't go into it, but boy, I invite the listeners to get that book and read it. But Avak actually gets ordained as a Pentecostal holiness minister in 1949. They felt his ministry was legitimate. They ordained him as the Pentecostal Holiness Church, but eventually they let him go too when they learned about his immorality. And it said, Avak's self-promotion and appearance are strongly reminiscent of the Manifest Sons of God doctrine of the Latter Days movement. So we see a lot of that tied together, with when the Manifest Sons of God doctrine began around the late 1940s. So it was mostly an Arminian group that there was surrounding Avak at the time in Miami. So Avak was breaking up these marriages, and this one big story that became in the newspapers a lot, it was Frederica Phillips and Chachow. The divorce decree was Chachow versus Chachow, but Frederica, she ended up taking a lot, and her and Avak kind of did stay together. But the value that she got was $2.2 million in addition to 4 hotel properties, very, very large sum of money. So we see how Avak's strategy, to keep himself very well off. And eventually, when Frederica died, she left him quite a sum of money. He was awarded $3,000 US annually, and that's a salary of $42,000, today's money. Pretty good sum of money back in those days. He also got another $2,000 to cover college expenses for any children he might have one day. And that's pretty prophetic as well, because he eventually had some children out of wedlock that actually took on his name. So Avak eventually stayed in the United States all these years and eventually died here. But he used that healing revival momentum to carry him on through, and kind of became a little cult leader of his own. Moved up into New York. They bought this castle-like place, and his hallway, his bedroom down the hall, they said was very close to the women, I guess, that would go in and out of his room at times. So it's kind of an under the cover thing that would happen. But so that's how Avak ended up. He just ended up with a small group of following. They didn't really become nationwide, and it kind of fizzled out. But there may still be a following there today that still follows the teachings of Avak.
What was created was a complete mess. I think, pure, plain and simple. I don't know any other way to explain it. And I know people are listening to this and thinking, yeah, but how does this tie to latter rain? How does it? I mentioned Pentecostalism. Who was the man that I'm talking about, Pentecostalism? Well, you mentioned little David Walker, and you can study latter rain, and anybody who's familiar with latter rain knows little David Walker. It's a story of the floating, levitating boy, right, that toured with William Branham. Well, he was literally owned by Chaplain Raymond Hoekstra, who was one of Branham's early campaign ministers. You can go look up the lawsuits that were involved in the parents losing the son and then the fight to get him back. And anyway, he created this stage act of, I think he called them the Atom. You had the healer and the Atom, William Branham and little David Walker. Well, in that photograph of Avak, sitting there with William Branham, standing off to the right in the corner of this is Chaplain Raymond Hoekstra. So whenever the Kardashians, the Shakarians, all of these wealthy people were bringing in all of the Christian identity folk, they also brought in the Pentecostal stage act manager, Raymond Hoekstra, Chaplain Ray. And as we'll get into later in our episodes, he plays a significant role in multiple phases of William Branham's ministry, from the era in the early 1947s all the way to the cloud story that we'll get into, the crazy thing where all of the message people see this cloud and they think they're 7 angels. Raymond Hoekstra played a role in that as well. So Raymond Hoekstra was involved in this from start to finish, and so the combination of all of this, it seals the deal for me. This was deeply connected to Latter Rain, even though Latter Rain not yet fully existed. This thing that they created, that these men gathered all of the Christian identity leaders together to create a movement, it worked. They did create a movement, and that, they didn't claim ownership of the movement, but it sparked in Canada and came back in the United States, and then they capitalized off of it, heavily financially capitalized off of it. So we'll get into that in future episodes, but anyway, it's a crazy side story, and I think we're going to have a few crazy side stories as we go. So if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more information about Roy Davis and William Branham, you can read The Persuasive Preacher, The Gifted Prophet, and The Noble Politician. For more information about the dark side of the NAR and Christian identity, you can read From Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and soon Audible.